Hi everyone, I'm Alicia Barreiro. I work at the Latin American Faculty of Social Sciences in Argentina, and I also work at the National Council of Scientific and Technological Research in Argentina too. And today I'm going to reflect about the use of qualitative methodological research from the perspective of social representation. Specifically, I'm going to reflect on the way in which we think about other social groups and how can social representations contribute to the misrecognition of indigenous people in Argentina. Social representation of history are part of collective memory, and social representations are very important because when we are socialized during childhood and also during all our lives, we internalize the way in which we think about the past as a part of our own identity, and also we construct the way in which we think about social work and the way in which we think about other groups and the relations that we construct with such social groups are conditioned by the way in which we think about the past. Also, it is important that social representations of history or social representations of the past has a narrative structure, and in such narrative we can identify a moral judgment about what happened, about who did what and which ones were the bad ones and which ones were the good ones. Generally, the good ones are the ones that are part of their own social group, are the ones that we identified with. I'm going to analyze the remembering of the conquest of the desert. It was a military campaign carried out by the Argentinian government against the indigenous people who live or would inhabit in the current Argentinian territory. So the objective of the Argentinian government was to conquer this land, and as a result of this period of territorial expansion and national organization, lots of indigenous people were killed, and also lots of them were sold as slaves to the new landowners. The hegemonic narratives, it's about the Argentinian heroes, the Argentinian military heroes that conquered the land and pacified the violent indigenous tribes that tried to conquer the new white populations. And it is still expressed in textbooks, other kind of memorials like museums, or for example, in monuments, and in everyday speech. When people think about the conquer of the desert, they think in such a way. On the other hand, there is another narrative, the counter-narrative, that is embraced by indigenous people. From a few decades up to now, indigenous people start to organize themselves and to claim for reparation and for social recognition. But this counter-narrative emphasizes the killing. So the common sense appropriates this counter-narrative, emphasizing that all indigenous people were killed at such moments. So nowadays there is no indigenous people in Argentina. So indigenous people are part of the past, and we have to remember them because they are part of our national identity, but not in the present. In our study, we want to understand how these two narratives intervene in the way in which social groups, indigenous and non-indigenous peoples, relate each other nowadays, and also how these narratives contribute and constrain the construction of the indigenous identities. So we need to find a way to gather these narratives, and in that vein, we use or we base our study in the methodological qualitatives. That was an idea of Serge Moscovici, because Moscovici explained that social representations are complex phenomena and they involve explicit discourse, they involve material features of the environment, and also they are expressed in social interactions. So we need to address information from explicit sources and also for non-explicit sources. In such a way, we use, on the one hand, some quantitative instrument to have a preliminary idea of the beliefs and values attached to such narratives, and also about the general statements that compound that such narratives. But in the long run, we had to go through qualitative methods as interviews, observations. We were to a city when indigenous peoples live along with descendants of the militaries who participate in the conquest of the desert, and we register daily interactions in different social places, such, for example, museums, or we have interviews with indigenous and non-indigenous peoples. So, for example, one observation of a class, of a kindergarten class in the museum, it was a day when the kindergarten went to the museum and the students were there, and the teacher started explaining what they were seeing to the children, and they said, all these objects that are you seeing here show how many different things the indigenous people used to have and used to do. They used to have a flag, they used to care of their children, they used to prepare their own food. They also used to have a Thanksgiving ceremony that was called Vigilia, because they were a very grateful people. As you can see, all the statements about indigenous people are expressed in past tense. So in this presentation of indigenous culture, it seems that there is no more indigenous people in the present. Another piece of information came from an interview with an indigenous woman that teaches pottery to the indigenous children, and she said, I am the great-grandchildren of the chief of the Mapuche Pampa. In the year 1878, he was the first to suffer the brutal Argentinian invasion of the territories of our people. The suburbs were spread around, men were sent to jail or forced to do hard labor, women were sold or given away like property. Today, we are 200 families, and we have come together about 2,000 people, and there are still many more spread around the country. How can we live with dignity and preserve our community without the land? We can see in this fragment of this piece of interview that this woman changed from the past to present. She made differences between who they were and who they are nowadays. So this is very different compared to the previous structured information that comes from the observation of the kindergarten class at the museum. So this indigenous woman said, well, I don't know if I touch them to make pottery. I think they have it in their DNA, so they intuitively knew how to do it. People always think that being part of the indigenous community means that one has to continue doing things the way they were done in the past. They don't understand that we exist today and that our art belongs in the present. But at the same time that she affirms their identity in the present as a transforming identity, they also link the indigenous identity as DNA. So there is a strange link between past and present, and between a dynamic identity and an identity fixed in the DNA of the indigenous communities. To conclude, I want to remark that the use of qualitative research methods allow us to gather different expressions of these narratives that goes from explicit expressions in everyday discourse to non-explicit expression as the ones that are present in, for example, museum exhibitions. I don't have time today to show you some pictures of the museum exhibitions, but our analysis showed the same hegemonic narrative in the museum exhibitions too. So this kind of analysis allow us to interpret that hegemonic narratives tend to neglect the conflict between the two groups, between indigenous peoples and non-indigenous peoples in today's Argentinian society, by rendering the indigenous group invisible and representing the indigenous identity in an anachronistic way, putting them in the past. And the other narrative, the counter-narrative, evidence a tension between the assert of indigenous people to sustain their identification with their ancestors, and at the same time to recognize the change that their identity had along with the history